What helps me build friendships with others? I think
I would say shared experience.
Spending time together?
trying to meet people where they're at and not make early assumptions about maybe appearance, but asking some questions that go a little bit deeper.
A friendly smile, just being able to greet everybody and just say hello.
Open heart, open mind, being willing to, like David said, meet people where they are and creating spaces that facilitate interaction where we strive to get to know each other at a more deeper, meaningful level.
Finding common bonds.
Moving towards other people, it's easy to kind of do your own thing and be off to the side, but like being intentional about getting near other people and groups with other people, that helps a lot.
Well, again, good morning. Good morning. Great to see you. My name is George Davis. So, what about you? I mean, how would you answer that question? What has helped you build friendships with others? What have been the key ingredients? And I think that's an important question to ask because the reality is we now live at a time where it's becoming easier and easier to be disconnected. For a variety of reasons, a growing number of people in our culture are acknowledging that we feel more and more disconnected. Greater experiences of loneliness, fewer relationships that truly have a sense of connection and depth. And with that has come a rising number of people experiencing anxiety, discouragement, depression, and other mental health issues. But by contrast, the Bible gives us a very powerful vision of people connecting well. Jesus argued that a defining quality of his followers, a defining quality of places like Hershey Free Church should be the connection, the love that we are to have for one another. The Bible has this robust vision of what it means for us to connect and to love. And with that in mind, over this year, our theme is simply this: to connect well and live well. We want to just take basic steps to embrace Jesus' vision. So as we begin the fall, we're talking about, well, exactly what does this look like? You know, what does it look like to unpack Jesus' vision? And as we have been preparing for not only this series, but also for the upcoming year, a resource that's been helpful has been this book called Made to Belong by David Kim. I just wanted to make you aware of that and acknowledge kind of how this is influencing our thinking. This book really grows out of the experience of a large church on the West Coast that truly sought to embrace Jesus' vision of belonging and connection. And in the book, the author highlights 5 key practices that are part of this biblical vision. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to talk about really 5 practices that help us unpack Jesus' vision for connecting well and living well. And for those of you in small groups, particularly let me just remind those of you who are small group leaders, we've prepared a series of videos that kind of cover these 5 topics and also give you some guidance on how you can talk about this in your small group, how you guys as a group can process what it means to connect well with one another. So what does it really take to embrace Jesus' vision? What practices or habits are needed to take his vision seriously? We're going to talk about 5 practices, and we're going to jump right into practice number 1. And the practice I want to talk about this morning is arguably the most foundational. It's just priority. If we're going to embrace this biblical vision of relationships and connecting, it has to be a priority. Now, I realize at one level this is so foundational that it just seems obvious. I mean, it almost seems hardly worth mentioning. Yet the reality is, if we aren't willing to prioritize relationships, all the other things that we're going to talk about over these few weeks, all of that can simply become another stack of information that we never embrace and put into practice. Of course, if we're honest, we could spend a lot of time talking about just what gets in the way. What gets in the way of relationships in our lives. And I think for many of us, part of the reality is we're just very busy. Our lives move at a very quick pace. And yes, maybe we interact with lots of people during the course of the week, but often it's really just transactional relationships. Some of this is true in our family. The reality for us, some of us, is we have allowed our schedules to become so full with so much activity. It's almost like because we're prioritizing everything, we prioritize nothing. And we just keep moving. For some of us in our families, our kids are so busy, they're in so many activities, and there's just a speed, and we live on adrenaline, we live on shuttling kids back and forth, and somehow in the midst of all that, the priority of relationships can get lost. Maybe we live with what has been described as FOMO. You've heard about that, right? Fear of missing out, and so we need to be involved in as much as possible. Interesting, this week, when I was kind of looking into this, I actually discovered another fear. You've heard of FOMO. Now authors are talking about phobia, F-O-B-I. That's the fear of being involved. That for some of us, kind of what keeps us disconnected is that, relationships can be challenging, they can be costly, there's risk. So maybe you just kind of figure out how to live your life without getting too close, too involved. And, in some ways it's just easier to live online than in the real world. And so that leads to disconnection. I think also for some of us, maybe we just grew up in families where transparency, vulnerability just weren't part of the mix. And for some of us, just due to our own family experiences, things we've grown up with, it's shaped the way we interact with others, and we know how to live with a sense of protecting ourselves and not getting too close. We even know how to do church well that way, and we feel pretty comfortable doing it. We could take more time to talk about that, but I think you get the point. And my guess is, if you're honest, most of us can identify the things in our lives that have the potential of getting in the way of relationships. So given that reality, how do I know if I'm really embracing Jesus' vision, right? Maybe you would say, you know what, George, I am a follower of Christ, and I want to be faithful in following Jesus, but how do I know if I'm really making relationships a priority as he intended? Well, to answer that question, what I want to do this morning is I want to highlight for you two commitments that I think you see in the life of Jesus. I think it's pretty clear that Jesus prioritized relationships. So I want to look at what I think are two commitments that were central to how Jesus did that. And I think these two commitments are also central to us embracing Jesus' vision, central to us prioritizing relationships in our own context, in our own life stage, in our own situation. And of course, this is going to look differently for each of us. But if you can keep these two principles, these commitments in mind, I think it keeps you moving in a healthy direction. So what are those two commitments that I think we see at work in the life of Jesus? The first, simply put, is a commitment to community. It's a commitment to community. Let me take you to what I think is a fascinating scene in Mark chapter 3. This is early in Jesus' public ministry. And there we read this scene where his family kind of comes to see him. So this is Mark 3, beginning in verse 31. Then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived, standing outside. They're standing outside the house where Jesus was. They sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, "Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you." "Who are my mother and my brothers?" he asked. Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." Now, to understand this passage, I think we've got to understand the context. And what you and I need to understand is this. In a first century Jewish context, and I think this was also to some extent true in a first century Roman context. In so many ways, family is everything. Your family really was central in defining who you were. Your family was central in understanding your life story, your sense of identity. And family was just the central part of your universe in so many ways, even central to your own reputation. That was tied up with your family. In fact, I think that explains what's going on here. This is early in Jesus' ministry, right? He's already starting to generate controversy, do some amazing things. And I think members of his family have heard about it, and they're now feeling maybe the pressure. Look what's going on in your family, and they feel like they need to intervene. So that's what they're doing here. And so in the midst of this experience, right, he's in this house, he's with his followers, and he looks at them and says, okay, so who is my real family? You guys are. You are my real family. And that may not seem shocking to us, but you just didn't say that in the first century, in this context. But Jesus did. And what this does is it tells us something about the community that Jesus was intending to create. Right? His work of restoration, his work of going to the cross, the good news of Jesus Christ, the gospel, his work was intended not simply to bring us into relationship with God, but also to bring us into relationship with each other. Jesus says nothing less than this: I am creating a new family. Now, what are families? I realize we've got to be careful when we talk about this, because some of you have some crazy, challenging, and even painful family stories and family histories. And I realize that. But at their best, families are places where we learn, places where we grow, places where we know others are for us. Places where we can learn to work through conflict and disagreement. And most importantly, places where we experience love. Larry Hurtado was a very gifted historian of early Christianity, a prolific author and scholar. And in much of his work, he wrestled with this question. He wrestled with the question, given the cost of becoming a Christian in the Roman world, why were so many people attracted to it? Right? Because there was always a cost. Yes, in some situations there was outright persecution, but even in places where there was not outright persecution, there was always a certain social stigma that you would experience in your family, in your workplace, in your community when you became a Christian in the first couple of centuries of Christianity. So given that cost, why were so many people attracted to Christianity? And as he researched that, a central part of his answer was this: love. I mean, Christianity taught of a God who actually loved people and sent his son to die for them. Furthermore, Christianity taught of a community where people were truly learning to love one another, and that was just unheard of. In fact, he writes, and I quote, "We simply do not know of any other Roman-era religious group in which love played this important role." Unquote. In fact, I think as you read the New Testament letters, part of what these letters are doing is working out Jesus' vision of community in very specific situations. For instance, think about that famous chapter on love in 1 Corinthians, where Paul says, love is patient, love is kind, love doesn't envy, it doesn't boast. And this is what your relationship needs to look like. And I think in that chapter, he's speaking very specifically to some of the challenges that have been at work in the Corinthian context. Yes, they have been boasting. Yes, they have been looking at each other competitively with envy. And he said, no, we're a family. We're in this together. So let's work out Jesus' vision for community in your particular context. And that's what this passage is doing. Or take another, I think, influential passage that we find in Hebrews 10, where the author says, let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Now, as this author is encouraging these recipients kind of with the vision that Jesus has for community, if I could highlight one thing, it would be just the issue of intentionality that he is stressing. And that intentionality really functions kind of in two ways in this passage. First, the command in this passage is this, that we are to spur one another toward love and good deeds. There's kind of the vision of what is to happen in community, right? We're to be a place that's for one another, encouraging one another, challenging one another, being for one another. So there's this intentional purpose that the author highlights. But not only does he highlight intentional purpose, he also says for this big purpose to become a reality, you've got to be intentional with how you schedule it, right? He talks about your activity, not giving up meeting together. And so I think this passage is so practical because in essence what he's saying is this, look, here's the big vision that Jesus has for community, and you need to make that a priority. You're to be in these kinds of relationships where we really are encouraging and spurring one another on. But if you're going to be intentional in living out that vision, you also really need to be intentional with your calendar. You need to be intentional with your activity. So he's showing us this intentionality in kind of two different levels, and I think both of them are important because, for instance, some people can be really intentional with the activity. Man, I come to church, I'm involved in a group, but we're not always really intentional in purpose. I mean, if we're honest, I think all of us have been in church situations, even group situations, where we're not really connecting. We're just kind of going through the motions and feel like I'm checking off that box of activity. But we really haven't engaged the purpose for which we are to be meeting. And so when you look at the life of Jesus, and then look at how his teaching is unfolded in the rest of the New Testament, there really is this commitment to the community that Jesus is now creating. And as a church, we want to be intentional in providing opportunities for you to do just that. And so throughout this series, we're just going to highlight different ways that you can get connected, different ways that you can have the opportunity to really build relationships with others. And so this morning, I'm going to mention 3 that may be appropriate for you. A couple of them are coming up very soon, so I wanted to highlight them today. The first is Alpha. So maybe you're here, maybe you're joining us online, and you would say, I'm not sure I'm ready to connect to a group or anything like that because I've got a lot of questions about Christianity. Well, Alpha is just this opportunity in a safe environment to explore questions, to get to know other people, kind of asking the same questions, and just to have good conversation. Or maybe you know someone that is kind of in having those kinds of questions, and this is an opportunity to encourage them or invite them to be a part. So that's actually starting this week on Thursday, so maybe that is the next step for you. We also have retreats coming up for both men and women that we're going to be a part of. This men's retreat is coming up at Camp Orchard Hill in October, so that's just around the corner. But guys, it's an opportunity just to connect and build relationships with other guys in the church. Likewise, in the spring, we have a women's retreat coming up. And in March, and for women, that's an opportunity for you to connect with other women in the church. If you'd like more information on any of these opportunities, as you leave at the hub right here in the main lobby, there'll be people you can talk with. You'll see the signs for each of these events, and they'd be glad just to give you more information. And if something just stirred within you, I would encourage you to at least have the conversation. Because we want to be committed to community. Now, with that in mind, there's one other thing that I want to do this morning. And it reflects a goal that our leaders have had as we started this theme of connecting well and living well. One of our goals as we began planning was this, kind of a simple goal. Wouldn't it be great if over the course of the year, each of us would meet 5 people that we didn't already know? That doesn't mean we're going to become best friends, but at least could we be able to recognize them and greet them by name. And maybe know something about them so that periodically through the year, we'd, hey, good to see you. And just to begin that experience, because that's part of, I think, embracing this vision that Jesus has of community. And so periodically throughout the year, just on certain Sunday mornings, I'm going to give you a little time to do that. And today, I'm going to give you the first opportunity. We're calling these Take 5 Moments, just to give you some time just to perhaps interact with someone you don't normally meet or see or talk with, someone you've never met. And what I'm going to do is give you a couple of minutes to do this, encourage you to move around if you need to, just to talk to someone that maybe you don't know or haven't really gotten to know. And to help the conversation, I'll give you 2 questions you may find helpful. Just as opportunities just to kind of introduce yourself or talk with the other person. One is, what's one thing you hope to do over the next year? And that doesn't have to be anything big. Maybe it's a home improvement project. I've asked this question to a lot of groups. My favorite one was, I just hope to clean out the garage over the next year. Maybe it's something you hope to do. Maybe it's a milestone. Something take a next step in your work, or, my son's graduating, my daughter's going to get her driver's license. Maybe it's some kind of milestone like that. Maybe it's an event. I'm just looking forward to this movie coming out or this concert. Or I love the holiday season, and here's what I'm looking forward to at Christmas. I realize I'm not trying to stress you out, but just give you an opportunity to talk with people and give you some tracks to run on. I think another question you might want to answer is, what's one thing about your life that's unusual or unexpected? Maybe it's, for some of us in our job history, there have been some unusual jobs, right? So I'll just go ahead and answer the question. When I was in college one semester, I co-hosted a children's radio program on Sunday mornings in Dallas, and I co-hosted it, or Saturday mornings, and I co-hosted it with a clown. And you're going, oh, that explains a lot now, George, doesn't it? That career was very short-lived. So maybe for you, maybe it's an unusual job, maybe it's where you've lived, maybe it's, a skill you've developed or something you've done. Think about one guy in our church who's gone skydiving, maybe something like that. And I realize this is going to pushes us out of our comfort zone. But remember, we're trying to embrace Jesus' vision, and sometimes these are the kinds of steps that help us do that. So just be open over the next few moments to just have a conversation. So now we're going to break just for a couple of minutes. So see if you can talk with someone you haven't met or you don't really know well, and maybe these questions will help you in your conversation. You may begin. Okay? Okay, I'm going to interrupt you. So I apologize if I cut some of you off. So maybe there are opportunities to continue these conversations afterwards, and maybe you need to write down the name of somebody you just met, just to kind of remember. I'm going to have to do that. I just met a guy, so I'm going to do that. And again, hey, like I said, we're not going to do this every Sunday. So I realize for some of us this is very stressful, and I want to acknowledge that. But also, hopefully, it's like, wow, that's an interesting story, or it's nice to meet you. And this is just part of embracing Jesus' vision. It's a powerful vision, isn't it? This vision of community. And in some ways, it feels so countercultural in our context, yet this was what Jesus was bringing about. Now, as I said a few moments ago, there are two commitments that I think are important in kind of prioritizing relationships the way Jesus did. The first is community, and kind of, so what is it like for me to be involved in community, in church, and how do I build those relationships? But there's a second commitment that I think was also evident in Jesus' life, and I just want to really briefly highlight that for you as well. And that commitment was not only to community, but to hospitality. Now, I realize when I say hospitality, the first thing you think about is, well, having people over for a meal. Now, that's definitely an example. But biblically, I think the theme of hospitality is broader than that. Biblically, here's kind of what hospitality gets at. Biblically, the idea of hospitality, it's a posture of welcoming others. I mean, here's what we see in the life of Jesus, right? Even as he's investing in his disciples, right? He's building this community. He's preparing them to be leaders in the early Christian movement. But even as he's doing that, he's always engaging with people. He's always engaging others with a posture of welcoming and hospitality. And this included people who were his followers, as well as people who were very far from God. Of the four gospel writers, Luke is really the gospel writer that I think taps into this theme. For instance, let me take you to Luke chapter 4. Jesus, again, in his ministry is in the synagogue in Nazareth, and he reads this powerful passage. He's quoting from the Old Testament here, and really as he describes and defines his own ministry, using these Old Testament texts, he says, "The Spirit is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Now, here's what's really fascinating. In Luke's gospel, the term that's translated favor, that's a legitimate translation. But elsewhere, it really communicates the idea of welcoming, of hospitality. And I think what Jesus is saying is this: look, I have come to fulfill these Old Testament promises, right? These promises that he would ultimately describe as the coming of the kingdom of God. And that's what his work is bringing about. And as he comes bringing the kingdom, it's a kingdom that comes with a posture of welcoming. It comes with a posture of hospitality. Even as he comes to establish his community, he's living that mission out with a posture of hospitality in which he's for others. He is welcoming others. So he comes with this mission to rescue and restore. Throughout his work, he comes engaging all sorts of people with a posture of hospitality. In fact, arguably, this posture of hospitality is one of the things that gets him in trouble. Remember, we continue reading in Luke's gospel. There are those famous parables that Jesus tells of the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son. And don't forget the context of those parables, right? The context is Jesus is being criticized for his hospitality. In Luke 15, here's what we read. This is what sets up the telling of those three parables. Right? The religious leaders, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, and they complained, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. It's a posture of hospitality. And I think if we are to prioritize relationships the way Jesus did, I think part of what that looks like is just developing that posture of welcoming as we go through our everyday life experiences. Josh Jipp is a scholar who's kind of done some really helpful work on this theme of hospitality, and in his book he writes, "We are God's guests and friends, and it is because of God's extension of hospitality and friendship to us that the church can offer hospitality to one another and to those seemingly outside the reach of our faith communities." So what does this look like? I think it could be things like being intentional and connecting with friends, taking initiative to have neighbors over, being fully present in conversations, asking good questions, being willing to start conversations. And as you think about this, let me just kind of, as I've been kind of preparing for this series and thinking about, okay, so what does this look like for me? And thinking about this theme of hospitality, here are two things that I found helpful just to keep in mind as I engage other people. First of all, I need to recognize everyone has a story and everyone has a challenge. Everyone has a story and everyone has a challenge. And unfortunately, sometimes in the busyness of life, the transactional nature of so much of our connecting, we lose sight of the fact that people we're interacting with, everybody's got a story, and I think everybody's got a challenge. Right? And to some degree, you walked in and maybe there's some issue you're wrestling with, some decision, things with your kids, finances, health. This is just part of life. There are always things churning in our minds that in some ways are a challenge, an opportunity, things we're working through. Everybody you meet has a story, and everybody has a challenge. So last weekend, I was at Costco having my tires rotated. I'd made an appointment. But when I got there, they were really busy. There were people in front of me. They were asking all sorts of questions. And so I had to wait. Now I've been waiting maybe 15, 18 minutes. The time for my appointment has already come and passed, but I'm at the front of the line. But right as I get to the front of the line, this older woman comes in and she sits down on the bench. And right as I'm getting to the line, the clerk looks at me and this is what she says. She looks at me, then she looks at the woman and she says, she doesn't give any explanation, she just says, "I'm going to deal with her first." Now let me be fully transparent. You know where I'm going with this, don't you? Thank you. We all will. Thank you. I thought, good. That's right. I thought he's the pastor. He's supposed to. Understand at this point, my frustration level has risen. Understand at this point, there have been thoughts running through my mind like, why do these people ask all these questions? Why can't they do their research online like I do, right? Why don't they have more than one clerk at the front? I only need to drop off my car. And I kid you not, I almost jumped on this clerk to say, wait a minute, I was here first. Wait a minute, I have an appointment and that time has passed. Wait a minute, all I need to do is drop off my car. But I didn't. And the only reason, to be honest with you, the only reason I didn't was I've been working on this series. Now we'll close in prayer. And the only reason I didn't, I've been working on this series, and I've been kind of just been wrestling with these stories in the life of Jesus. And by God's grace, I just caught myself, and I was quiet. So I'm standing there, and this older woman gets up, and she's having this conversation with the clerk. And of course, I'm hearing the whole conversation. And that's when I realized she'd actually been in and out that day. She'd already been there earlier this morning. That's also when I realized that her husband is in the hospital. And that's the moment where I said, I'm so glad I didn't say anything. Well, that would have been quite a jerk moment, right? And as it turns out, at one point while we're waiting, we both end up seated next to each other. And again, kind of just thinking through what we're going to be talking about over this series, I just started a conversation. I just said, tell me about your husband. And I got the whole story. And ultimately, that question led to other parts of the conversation. And I got her whole life story. I even found out she's also from Texas. That's right. Our God is a missionary God here in Pennsylvania. And as Texans do, we talked about barbecue. Real barbecue. We talked about. Finally, her car was ready, and she got up and she just looked at me and said, thank you. This has been a delightful conversation. It's helped pass the time. And it was like something deep inside at the core of my being just reminded, see, I told you. Everybody's got a story. Everybody's got a challenge. So, George, I want you to go through, I want you to embody, George, my values of the kingdom. I want you to value and embody my hospitality. Everybody's got a story, so be curious. Everybody's got a challenge, so be gracious. Now, this theme of hospitality, it's big, it's kind of very abstract. So in thinking about this, I thought to make it concrete, I would just, as I begin to wrap up, would just give you this challenge. As we talk about kind of embodying the priority of Jesus, my challenge to you is just, what's one act of hospitality that you can do this fall? Just what's one act of hospitality? I'm not going to tell you what that looks like, but maybe you can wrestle with that. Maybe it's, I think for some of us, maybe that are a little more adventurous, maybe it's, when I come into church on a regular basis, I really want to be looking out for people I don't know. And I realize it's always awkward. Well, I don't know how long they've been here. What if I'm there? What if I'm newer than they are? I get that. We always don't know how to have that conversation. One person helpfully said, well, just ask, how long have you been coming? Right? I said, that's helpful. So maybe for you, it's just taking the step of being intentional and trying to engage people you don't know, even as we did this morning. Maybe it's reconnecting or kind of building into a relationship where you'd say, this is a relationship I'd really like to grow, but I've got to do something intentional for that to happen. Maybe you would say, a great step I could take is simply trying to be more fully present in conversations. Eye contact. Putting down my phone. Asking good questions, right? I think some of us know we have a habit. We engage people in conversation, but we dominate the conversation. Maybe as a family, it's, there's another family. Wouldn't it be great just to have them over at some point? Maybe it's being hospitable to people in service industries, right? And some of you are in service industries. You know how hard that can be. How can, in some of those interactions, how can I be kind and just treat them like fellow humans? Maybe it's greeting people in those awkward moments where we tend to be silent, waiting in line, elevators, gas pump, just being attuned to, hey, there's just simple ways to live out the hospitality of Christ. So what's one thing that you can do? And again, remember, this all flows out of Jesus' vision. He came to rescue and redeem and restore. He came bringing the kingdom of God and creating a new community of people in relationship with God and each other. And in doing so, he came living out the values of the kingdom, including hospitality and showing that hospitality in all sorts of ways. So can we say, I want to make that vision a priority as we start this new academic year? And as we do that, I really do think we will connect well and live well. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for this amazing vision that Jesus gives us of what he's doing through the kingdom. How he's building a new community, and we've been invited to be part of that community. But furthermore, how he lived this life of hospitality, both with his followers and to those that were in many ways far away from you. There was just this posture of welcoming. And so, Father, I pray that we could hear that as well. And I pray we would just wrestle with what this can look like. For some of us, maybe there is a next step we need to take in terms of community. And likewise, could we just think about what are some simple things that we can do just to reflect the hospitality of Jesus Christ? So I thank you for the vision that Jesus gives us. And I thank you, in a world of growing disconnection, we've been invited to live differently. So I pray that we will embrace that vision. In Jesus' name, amen. At this time, I'm going to invite members of our prayer team to be here at the front, and maybe there are ways we can pray with you and pray about things we've talked about this morning, and we would really be glad to do that as part of your family. As you go, let me remind you, there'll be people in the lobby at the hub that can give you more information about Alpha or the men's retreat, the women's retreat. So if that is something that you have even the slightest interest in, I encourage you to stop by and just have that conversation. And now as you go, may we kind of go being reminded of the priority that Jesus makes in terms of relationships. And recognizing that as we embrace that priority, we can become people who truly are connecting well and living well. Amen.